So thank you all for coming. Assisted migration is obviously a topic that is on the radar for all of us. My name is Anthony Davis. I'm a faculty member at the University of Idaho, and with my colleague Cass Dumrose of the U.S. Forest Service, we've been talking about putting on a workshop of this nature for a couple of years now, and are happy to finally have brought it together. The idea is to foster discussion, so please ask questions, and then also to try to really give some current thought on where we're at as we move from that transition of just the theory of assisted migration into the implementation of assisted migration, and questions that come up like, what's the transition point between off-site planting and assisted migration, which I poached that from someone else this morning. So those questions that are out there, how do we make sure that they're not barriers to progress that needs to be made for effective stewardship of our natural resources? So we have a great lineup of speakers here today, and I'm going to hand this microphone over to Cass Dumrose, and then he'll serve as moderator for this morning.
Thanks, Anthony. Good morning, everyone. As Anthony said, I work for the U.S. Forest Service. I'm with the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Moscow, Idaho. I'm a research plant physiologist, and I also serve as the National Nursery Specialist. And this whole topic of assisted migration and how do we know when to move and where to move and what to move is a topic that's really of interest to me as it pertains to how nursery managers are addressing it and how they're going to provide the plant materials that we're going to need in the future. So I'm pretty excited about today as well. So let me get right into it here and introduce our first speaker. It's Mary Williams. Mary's a postdoc research ecologist with Michigan Technological University in Houghton, and is currently working with us at the USDA Forest Service facility in Moscow, Idaho. Mary received her PhD in rangeland ecology and management at the University of Wyoming. And she's currently working with us at the Forest Service and some colleagues at Michigan Tech on an annotation of native plant transfer guidelines with special emphasis on assisted migration, climate change, nursery operations, seed collection and storage, and restoration, and whatever else I think is important at the time. Right, Mary? A major goal of this project is to provide a literary foundation that will identify knowledge gaps and guide research and development to factor the future climate scenarios as they pertain to assisted migration. And Mary's talk this morning is Charting Assisted Migration as a Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. Mary.
Like Cass mentioned in his introduction, and thank you for that introduction, and Anthony as well, I'm excited to be here and talk amongst all of you and amongst the lineup of speakers that we have. It's pretty impressive. As Cass talked about the literary foundation, I started this project about a year ago collecting literature that's out there on native plant transfer guidelines and climate change and assisted migration, which to me that was kind of a new term because I've been working in sagebrush ecosystems and songbird habitat and working with current things going on the ground right now. So I avoided climate change for as long as I could, but it's really interesting. Anyway, in our database, we have over 700 articles right now, and it's huge, and it's all in digital form right now, and hopefully we can put it out there for people so they can search it and look for things like assisted migration. So I'm going to talk about assisted migration as an adaptation strategy, and I want to set the stage for the speakers that are talking today, introduce the terms, the concepts, but also introduce what we think would be, if you're actually going to implement this, what would your steps be? And it's very simple, as you'll see, and of course there'll be a lot of questions associated with that, which I hope people will be thinking about throughout the day and have a really good discussion about it as well. So if climate change predictions are correct, plants will need to adapt or move several kilometers north or to higher elevations in order to avoid negative consequences like decreased growth. So this is from a recent publication, and it shows the distribution of western larch in 2000, 2030, and in 2060. So in the next 18 years or so, western larch is going to need to move pretty quickly. So we may need some human assistance with this. Some climate effects may be so abrupt, like the mountain pine, the bark beetle outbreaks, warmer temperatures, decreased precipitation, coupled with management activities. These climate change impacts are so abrupt that our management options are quite limited in these situations. So many plants will not be able to move fast enough or adapt without some sort of human assistance. And what do I mean by human assistance? Johnny Appleseed? Well, yeah, but not exactly. Our context has changed a little bit. We've moved plants around a lot in our lifetime. But what I'm talking about is human assistance, movement of species in response to climate change. Now, assisted migration, that term in the literature is pretty common, but there are also other terms that are pretty common as well. Assisted colonization, the movement and establishment of species in response to climate change, pretty similar to assisted migration. Managed relocation, intentional movement of units to locations outside their historical distribution for the purposes of maintaining ecosystem services. Now, these definitions are all pretty similar. Assisted migration, in a review of assisted migration, that term was used most commonly in the literature. They have all these terms out there. People have introduced, trying to standardize the terminology, and I don't think we've come to a consensus, especially between plants and animals. I just talked with Fish and Wildlife, some Fish and Wildlife folks in Moscow, and she's like, well, we're calling it managed relocation, but I like assisted colonization. So it's like, oh, okay. It's going to come down to people's opinions. But we're talking about the same thing. I mean, moving species, populations, ecosystems for different reasons. So the first comprehensive review of assisted migration was done by Hewitt and others in 2011. They looked at 63 articles on assisted migration. They also looked at managed relocation and assisted colonization in their search terms. It was first introduced in 1985 by Peters and Darling. Now, they didn't say assisted migration, but they said that we're going to need to do something to help plants adapt or migrate because of climate changes. And then it just kind of took a hiatus, disappeared in the literature until about 2007, where some articles were published in opposition of assisted migration. So that spurred up a lot of discussion and talk. So you see a bump in 2007 and since then. So in that study, they divided those articles up into research, literary reviews, commentary, and of course, what we're seeing still today is a lot of literature that's just reviews and commentaries about assisted migration, which is good. It's good to have discussions and debates about it. The groups, there was just no focus. It was just talking about, species in general, plants, animals. Of those groups, plants were most commonly talked about. And within the plants, trees, of course, are talked about quite a lot. When I started this project, we wanted to focus on what transfer guidelines are out there for grasses and shrubs and forbs, which is very little. And of course, a lot of the research that's been done already is on tree species. So there are 3 prevalent reasons in the literature for assisted migration, and the most prevalent for conservation reasons to prevent species extinction. There's an effort already undergone in the U.S. It's a grassroots effort in Florida with Torreya taxifolia. It's a conifer species that's going extinct. So private citizens came together out of concern for the species. And since 2008, they've already planted Torreya in 5 states north of its range in Florida. And this has prompted the Fish and Wildlife Service actually to consider this as a conservation strategy for the species. But we don't have any current government policies or mandates for this type of strategy right now. The second most prevalent to prevent loss in our economic resources. So this would be for commercial species, thinking about moving them, start planting them north or in higher elevations. In Canada, for example, and we have some speakers here that will probably expand on this a little bit more, they're considering planting species anticipated to migrate north, so like ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, to prevent economic losses in the commercial industry. And the third most prevalent, ecosystem services, which timber falls under an ecosystem service. So we might consider moving groups of species, ecosystems, to maintain habitat quality, biological function, hydrologic function, and so forth. Ecosystem services is just now starting to get into the literature and people talking about that, more so than just species-specific strategies. So there are many forms of assisted migration, and from the literature, these are 3 that I, picked out in assisted migration. So you can have assisted population migration, moving populations north within their current range. So that's taking seed sources, populations that are going southern and planting them up north. Assisted range expansion, moving those populations to areas maybe that their historic range, or moving them to areas where you know that the habitat is going to be suitable. And then it's assisted species migration, which would be an example, the Florida torreya that I already talked about, moving that species that's going extinct or their habitat is decreasing, and moving them into areas where, it goes beyond their natural range of dispersion. So your distances are going to be different from each of those forms. There are, of course, ecological and economic risks with using this as a strategy. I won't go into these too much. I think this will spur up some conversation throughout the day. Costs are going to increase with migration distance. So if you're moving a species, a population within its current range, it will not be as expensive as something like Florida torreya, where you're moving that species into areas beyond where it's currently growing. You can have establishment failure, moving that species too soon into an area. Maybe the site isn't ready for it, or the species is not ready for movement. Effect on the donor ecosystem, removing genetic resources from your source area, so taking genetic information out of that area. Loss of function or structure, maybe you're focusing on a key species that's providing key functions or structure to an already existing ecosystem, and you're taking that out prematurely. Effect on receiving ecosystem, there's a lot of literature about invasive potential of species, moving them from one location to another. Are we going to create another invasive species? And of course, genetic effects, inbreeding, outbreeding, depression, hybridization that could occur within populations by moving them. And these are all things that are discussed at length in the literature and still need more attention. So this goes back to that earlier paper I discussed with Western Larch that was done. So black is the current distribution of Western Larch in the Pacific Northwest, and pink are seed source locations for a target planting site. So this area right here, this is the current, and then predicted in 2030. So the pink are where you collect seed for that planting location. So this is in 2000, and these are some of the issues that we're dealing with assisted migration. And very few studies have been been done on species where you're looking at their current distribution and also projected out in 2030 and 2060 using a combination of emissions and climate models. So this is an issue if you're collecting seed from these areas for that target location, but then, 15 or so years from now, that seed source right there would be no longer compatible for that particular area. So this is just one thing to think about with assisted migration. Conservation plans, whether or not we implement assisted migration, I think our conservation plans need to incorporate climate change impacts into management. This is nothing profound. What I find interesting about this is that it was said almost 30 years ago. So we've known about climate change and we've known about assisted migration over the last 30 years. And I think just now we need to be proactive and start implementing things. So within the literature, there are a few frameworks and guidelines. Okay, are we thinking about assisted migration? How can we do it? We can use climate change models using genetic information from species that we have and looking at what their future distribution will be and whether or not that species is at risk of decline under climate changes. We can use previous reintroductions of native plants to look at how they responded to movement, how they responded to being established in a new site. Implement experiments. Canada is doing a lot of experiments right now. Their assisted migration adaptation trial that's going on. So we can learn from those experiments. And also the Torreya is another example where we can look at how those plants are establishing well in those states that they've been planted in. Like I said before, we've been moving plants around for a long time. So it's going back into those databases, looking at their success, their failures, and also asking managers at these different agencies, have you moved the plant around and how did it do? Most oftentimes, if it didn't do well, it's not recorded, which is unfortunate. And we can also look at the pollen and fossil record to look how plants responded to changes in the climate in the past. So these are resources that we have, we can use and improve upon as well. So I changed this up a little bit from a publication in 2008. And this is just a framework to decide whether or not to implement assisted migration, if it's even possible. So your species selection, you're going to have different purposes: prevent species extinction, preserve economic goods, sustain ecosystem services, and so forth. So what is the risk of decline, of extinction under climate change? Well, in order to get to implement assisted migration, the species needs to be at high risk. Is establishment possible? Yes or no? Is establishment possible for an assisted migration? That needs to be pretty high. Do benefits outweigh the costs? And this is really important too, because if you don't have money to do such a thing, it's going to be really difficult to implement. So, yes, the benefits outweigh the costs, and then, we can implement assisted migration. Pretty simple. Unfortunately, frameworks are good. Decision frameworks are excellent for making these kinds of choices. However, you need to know a lot about a species or a population, to flow through this chart. There are some other guidelines that I drew upon to come up with an actual guideline process to implement assisted migration. So species, you select your species, determine migration distance, collect seed, you propagate, you choose your sites, you outplant, and you monitor. Now this is not, unlike any other reforestation or restoration component list. But what's really important for system migration, it's first going to be your species, but then your migration distance, how far are you going to move that species and where. Within this framework, you're going to have many spatial and temporal decisions to make and also issues that will come up. I'm hoping that throughout the day we can talk about those spatial and temporal issues, like where do you move it, when do you move it, and so forth. Right now I'm going to focus on the species and migration distance. So implementation, select species. You may have a commercial species or a non-commercial species, conservation species, and 2, determine suitable distance. And there are some tools we can use to determine that distance. So seed transfer guidelines and seed transfer zones, and also climate models and predicted range. The climate models and predicted range, it's best done when you have genetic information, that genetic variability for that species. Unfortunately, we have that information for very few species when you think of all of the species and populations. So seed transfer guidelines, guidelines to restrict the movement to avoid maladaptation. And seed transfer zones are areas where species can be transferred with little risk of maladaptation. And the other presenters will be talking more about this later on. So I just wanted to introduce those terms so we're all on the same page. This is a simple way for me to explain guideline and zone development. So you would collect seeds from many locations, many populations for a target species. This shows just Washington and Oregon and locations of collecting seed. This is from Douglas Fir, and I borrowed these slides from people in the Forest Service. You collect the seeds, you grow in a common garden, measure adaptive traits. Those adaptive traits are going to be selected based on your objectives. So tree height, drought tolerance, cold tolerance, and things like that. Next, you would model those traits with the source's climate, and then putting that all into a GIS and mapping those transfer zones delineated based on adaptive variability for that particular species. And you come up with seed zones of adaptive variability. So this is just a gross sort of step-by-step simple guideline and zone development. There's a lot that goes into this that I'm not going into right now, but will be discussed later. So the authors and I, sort of decided that you would have 3 situations for system migration. One would be you have a commercial species and you have known transfer guidelines. You'd have a conservation species with known transfer guidelines. There are very few. And conservation species and unknown transfer guidelines, and this is pretty common. So for commercial species, I'll show Western larch again, because I've been talking about Western larch. These are current seed transfer zones in Washington State. You can go to the current zones and say, okay, this is my zone for planting that particular species. And knowing that with changes in climate, those zones are going to change. But at least this is a starting ground. So if you have a conservation species, and some of these have been looked at already, I'm showing 2 examples, blue wild rye and sagebrush, where genetic studies have been done and adaptive variability has been done on them. And so you can use these provisional transfer zones to guide your movement. And now these are all current zones and guidelines, and so these will change with the climate. And last, when you don't have any genetic variability information, you can use provisional seed zones based on minimum temperature. And this is for Oregon, and this is very general, just like native plants for all species. But this is at least a starting point to get you thinking about species ranges and how far can I push the species or not. I think right now there's a website, the Native Seed Network, and the Seed Zone Mapper down here at the bottom. They're already looking at conservation species, some grasses and some forbs and shrubs, to getting that genetic information, the climate information, and developing seed zones and guidelines for those species. And these are important restoration species that are used quite often. Other internet resources, there are several out there right now. Brad St. Clair, who's giving a talk later, is quite involved with the seed lot selection tool. I don't know if anyone's gone to that website, but it's pretty slick. You can choose your species, tree species, and say, I have a seed lot, where can I actually plant it? It gives you a nice map output, and it's really quite wonderful, I think. So creating tools like that is going to help make decisions about the system migration, and hopefully people are out there using it. The Center for Forest Provenance Data, you can go to that website, you can retrieve provenance data. You can also input the data, and Brad knows more about that than I do, as far as what kind of data what format does your data need to be into in order to input it into that system. So I'm going back to Western Larch, because this is one of the species Jerry Rayfelt has done a lot of work with. And so if we're thinking about a system migration, and you pick Western Larch, for example, and you want to start implementing a system migration for that species. So this is, these two figures are projected distribution of, or seed zones for Western Larch in 2030. So the black, again, is the current distribution of Western Larch. The pink for each of these slides is seed collection areas for 2 different target locations in British Columbia. So if you wanted to plant Western Larch up here, location of your seed sources, collecting seed plant material for that location. If you wanted to plant Western Larch maybe further down south, your seed zones, seed collection areas would change. So this is great information for this particular species, but it takes a lot of time to do something like this. And Jerry's currently working on Douglas fir and ponderosa pine to get these maps out there for those important commercial species. There are, of course, limitations. We have a lot of uncertainty about future climate conditions, especially for predicting beyond 2050. You can have establishment effects, like I talked about earlier. The plant may not establish well in its new environment. It can also impact other species in that ecosystem. And also, uncertainty. When I was talking with Jerry a couple weeks ago, he's working on ponderosa pine. He said one difficult thing he's finding is, where ponderosa pine is growing now, he can't find locations where it would be suitable in 2060 or beyond. So that's a problem with, if you're thinking about a system migration for a particular species, it's like, that location where it's at now, it's not showing up in 2060. So, and these are all modeling, they have some uncertainty with them, but, they can at least point us in the general right direction. Of course, limitations on species biology and behavior. We're looking at trees, they're longer species. They may need more help than perennials, annuals, biennials. They might adapt more quickly to changes in climate, and so may not need as much as attention. And of course, there's that human element in all of this. Especially talking to Jerry, he's done so much work on everything, and his brain is full of information. So, we're talking about losing human resources, the human element, all those online tools and decision support systems are out there that use the current technology, but some people may just not know how to use them. And so, especially for a manager that's been at an area for more than 30 years and collecting data, and you present this tool to them, they're like, oh, I don't have time for that. And, it's true. And so we need to consider also the human element in all of these decisions and planning. And current policies can constrain our decisions. We are, the current seed zones and seed transfer guidelines for tree species, we're limited right now. We can't really, in the U.S. especially, start implementing projects and have the support from the government. And that's why the Torea was a grassroots effort. Private citizens were concerned about this species, and so they just started implementing the program. I'm not advocating any rogue experiments, but if you're constricted by policies and want to do something, some people are just, go other routes. Research needs, pretty common within the literature, and there are a lot of needs. We need current and dynamic seed transfer zones for those species that we have genetic information for. Like the Western larch example that I showed, of course that takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. Risk assessments, this would probably be the most important thing, or the initial step would be to identify those habitats and those species that will be at risk of decline and extinction or climate change. So there are a lot of vulnerability assessments out there, lots of tools, the Forest Service involved in, and other agencies. Adaptation studies, we can look at those assisted migration projects that are already underway, especially up in Canada. Look at landscape connectivity. So it may not be that a species, as we're fragmenting the land, we're, reducing the land area for that species to migrate naturally. So looking at conserving those landscape connections for this species. And ecosystem engineering, this is another area that we could look at. So areas that are severely disturbed, those might be areas where, okay, let's implement an assisted migration project there because, that system maybe has lost its function or structure. Let's, play around with it a little bit. I mean, in restoration ecology, I've done a lot of work in coal mine reclamation where they're required to establish species after they've mined the coal. And so those are experiments to look at. There are a lot of successes and also failures in those types of systems. But you may look at some area, crested wheatgrass areas, and you're like, oh, let's try to get rid of this species and, look at, our database and our toolbox of species that we have and start planting those in those areas. Management actions, like we talked about before, incorporating climate change impacts information as soon as it becomes available is really important. And of course, collaboration. None of this is possible without meetings like this, workshops, people talking, saying, I've got an area, I've got a seed lot, I've got a provenance test going on right now, what do you think about it? So I think that's probably the most important thing is for us to communicate and collaborate with each other. Just summary, I talked about climate change and adaptation a little bit, and assisted migration as one of those strategies, and the terms and the synonyms that are out there: assisted colonization, managed relocation. There's also managed translocation, a lot of those terms. Of course, we're going to be limited by time, space, money, but identifying those research needs can alleviate some of those limitations that we have. And of course, incorporating all of our knowledge into management actions, giving suggestions from our database of knowledge and understanding, and putting that into those into the minds of the people making the policy decisions. In closing, I'd like to thank Marty Jurgensen at Michigan Tech, Tom Landis, who's a nursery consultant here in Oregon, Jim Marin helped us with our graphics, and lots of people at the Forest Service where I took some slides from and information from and put it in this presentation. I'd also like to thank Anthony for putting this workshop together and bringing us all here. I think I'm really excited about today and to hear the other speakers, and it'll be a good talk. My information and Cass's information there, and I think it's also on the handouts, hopefully, that are out there, but I'll be around today, so come talk to me, and I think are we doing questions after?
Sure. We do have some time for some questions, and I would ask Mary, make sure you repeat it so that it is also digitally recorded.
Okay. Questions? We do have quite a bit.
Actually, you don't.
Oh, we don't? Oh, that's...
It's a long story.
I was like, it's been 35 minutes for a long time.
Very good. If there are no questions, we'll keep moving along. And Marcus has one. Okay.
Question. So I'm curious, in your literature search, what definitions, if any, jumped out at you were available for climate adaptation?
So the question was, are there any terms out there for climate maladaptation?
Well, it's more specific definitions. For example, is it with respect to loss of ecosystem services that are using interruption? Or is it with respect to reduction of fitness or